In order to start that part of the session, first of all, cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Hi. Okay. In order to start this part of the session of Marko's presentation, instead of with no one's new around the table, so we don't need a new round of introduction. Thanks. My tradition was instead of traditional introduction to Marko, I want to tell a very, very short story about one of our interactions. Yes, one of our recent interactions.
Okay.
As part of the paper I was trying to write, I did what most of us do at some point when we get bored out of the research, and asked ChatGPT, can you give me relevant articles on my topic? And the ChatGPT was very happy and gave me a few very relevant articles on the topic, including one titled Hostages, International Legal Aspects by Marko Milanovic, published on the European Journal of International Law, Volume 20, Issue 1, February 2009. I was very happy.
Obviously fake. Yeah.
I was so happy. Why?
You ruined the story.
A minute ago. You were part of the interaction.
Okay, go ahead.
I emailed Marko, so I looked it up. I look it up on HL. I look it up, and then on maybe SSRN, maybe something like that. No, he didn't write it, of course. And then I wrote him. Well, clearly that ChatGPT gave me that article of you. I know you didn't write it, but would you? So he didn't. Instead, he started writing a paper on state lies as violations of international law, which we'll now hear about.
Thank you. So the paper is not on state lies as violations of international law. It's on state lies as violations of human rights, because actually you can write a broader paper about how state lies can violate all sorts of other rules of international law, mainly state-related. So, for example, the principle of non-intervention. But the paper I'm working on is on human rights law specifically. It is not really related to the topic of the workshop. You know, it's not necessarily the best fit. To my defense, I offered Ido 4 choices, and this is the one he picked, right? So if you think the fit of the paper and the workshop is not ideal, blame him, don't blame me, right? So the topic is basically this: when can a lie, meaning a statement that is untruthful, right, that is meant to deceive someone, when that statement is made by a state agent, when can that lie as such violate human rights of a person? That's the topic I'm basically dealing with. And it's, you know, so there's this whole new literature on mis and disinformation now currently, especially in the digital context, which I kind of wanted to avoid a bit, because most of that literature focuses on a different question, which is when can states regulate speech, false speech, for example, because of the harms that speech causes in a way that is compliant with freedom of expression and other human rights standards, right? So can the state prohibit anti-vaxxers from going on social media, spreading false information about vaccines? But that's not the topic I want to deal with. My topic is when states deliberately, intentionally deceive people, online or offline, right? And so I started looking into this a bit, and I was a bit shocked to find out that people have written about this before, but not when you would think about this. So there's nothing actually in the human rights literature that's about this. I found stuff, and now this is going to sound super pretentious, in Grotius and Plato. Let me just read you a quote from Plato's Republic, which obviously all of us read on a regular basis, okay? So this is what Plato, through the mouth of Socrates in the Republic, says. Then, if anyone at all is to have the privilege of lying, the rulers of the state should be those persons. And they in their dealing either with enemies or with their own citizens may be allowed to lie for the public good. Yeah, it's a nice statement. Yeah. So basically, his position, remember, was that a state, a republic, should be ruled by philosopher kings, and they know best, and they're allowed to lie both to their own people and to peoples of other states. So what I really explore, really, in the article, are two sets of scenarios. When a state lies to its own people, the other is when it lies to people of other countries. Yeah. So if you want to think of a scenario when a state lies to its own people, Venezuela has an election, they count the votes, and the president then says, "Oh no, I won." Yeah? You think you won? No, no, I won. And the election commission says, Maduro won, even though he didn't win. See what I mean? And the Supreme Court says, yeah, he did win, even though he didn't win. Huh? So that's a lie that a state directs at its own people. A lie, obviously, that autocracies engage routinely. So as the now departed head of the foreign department of the External Action Service of the EU, Josep Borrell, said, Russia, Putin, is constantly bombing the minds of his own people. It's a nice phrase. Yeah. So that's what autocracies do as a matter of course, but also democracies do the same thing. Democracies can, for example, and I'm not going to point any fingers. And at what point
do you stop calling them democracies, of course? So
true, but democracies can elect pathological liars as their leaders, and they've done that. Yeah. So, but democracies can also lie to, and other states, and authoritarian states can lie to the populations of other states. So there was, for example, an incident that was disclosed this year or last year, where it became apparent that the US Defense Department ran a vaccine disinformation campaign targeting various countries, including the Philippines. So the US Department of Defense was using fake social media accounts to tell the Filipino population at the height of the COVID pandemic that Chinese vaccines were unsafe and ineffective.
Did they acknowledge it?
They acknowledged it, they apologized.
Oh, that helps.
No. So obviously China and Russia have done the same thing. Google it. You're going to find Reuters articles about it.
It's not judging.
That's what they didn't reply.
They did.
Prosecutions.
So and there were hearings before the Filipino Congress on this. The Americans sent essentially a formal apology to the current president, who is totally not a liar. Bong bong. So anyway, you see the scenario. So the scenario is one where the state deliberately lies about vaccines to the population of other states. In some Muslim states, the same program run by the DoD emphasized false information that there were pig products in vaccines, and then therefore the vaccines were unclean from a religious perspective. See what I mean? All of this was done to malign China. There was no other reason to it, and the relevant Americans sort of acknowledged it. So that's the kind of scenario I really look at in the article. There's a big, by the way, how much time should I spend on this? 25 minutes. So there's a huge philosophical literature on the definition of lying and on the ethics of lying. So this is literally something that moral philosophers have written about for thousands of years. I'm not going to get into that. But what I explained, though, in the paper is why I choose the concept of a lie, as opposed to concepts like mis or disinformation, right? So, and why do I choose a particular definition of a lie? Forget about it. We don't need to get into that, right? But I want to avoid the impression that lying is something states only do online. Yeah, lying is done in all sorts of other contexts, and it may have nothing to do with the the sort of online disinformation kind of problem. Good. So the bulk of the paper really goes through various human rights and explains different scenarios in which state lies by state agents, persons whose conduct is attributable to the state, can as such, as a mere statement, violate human rights. Yeah? And then I have sections in the paper which are yet to be written, which are sort of adjacent to the topic of the conference. So one particular section is about lying to the population of other states, which raises this whole question of extraterritoriality, which we touched upon earlier today. And another section is about whether lies can ever be justified. So I'll talk about that later. So can you, within a human rights framework, ever justify lying to the extent that the lie interferes with a human right? And there are some scenarios where actually you could, maybe to save lives, you can lie. In wartime, we have all sorts of rules about perfidy, ruses of war, and so on that somehow align. So I will discuss that later in the paper. But let me briefly talk about the kinds of scenarios in which a lie can violate human rights as such. So the first scenario is one in which a lie is a means of inciting other human rights violations, including violence. So the state spreads false information about a certain person, yeah, in order to incite violence against them. So, for example, that can be a journalist, a political activist. It can be a whole group of people, right? It can be Myanmar lying about the Rohingya. You see what I mean? To incite mass violence against those people. It can be the state, spreading whatever information about either a political, religious group or journalists or activists in order to incite other actors to act upon the lie. So this is the most straightforward example. The scenario is one in which a lie is basically a means towards an end, like it is a tool of incitement. The second scenario, which is closely adjacent to the first one, is when the lie is a means of punishment, of harassment, of intimidation. So imagine you're a political activist, you're a journalist, and the state, through its agents, publishes a deep fake video of you online, yeah? And the deep fake video shows you doing something nasty, yeah? Some sexual thing or whatever it could be, yeah? And all of that is done to punish you for some kind of protected activity you've engaged in. For example, for engaging in your freedom of expression. Now, the same form of punishment and intimidation and harassment can also be done by truthful means. So imagine if they have a real video of you having sex with a goat or something, yeah? And they put it online, right? That is also injurious to your right to private life, to your freedom of expression, in the same way as a fake video would be. But lies tend to be weaponized by authoritarian states and hybrid regimes in this particular way. So there is no journalist or activist today working in countries like Hungary or Serbia or the Philippines who has not faced something like this. So state agents deliberately disseminating lies about them, about their allegedly corrupt behavior, about, their journalistic practices, about their activism, in order to punish them, harass them, or intimidate them. So essentially, the injury here is done by the lie, and the injury could be to very different rights, including your right to private life, including your freedom of expression. If you want to see a recent case before the European Court of Human Rights decided in October, it's sort of like that. This is a case called Kobalia versus Russia. So in that case, the court dealt with the Russian foreign agents law. So this is the law in which basically Russia proclaimed anyone receiving any money from abroad or having any ties with any kind of organization from abroad, including basically all of the civil sector in the country, including all human rights organizations like Memorial, forcing them to label themselves as foreign agents and to register as such, yeah? And the court said in the case that the stigma that this lie basically attached as such violated various rights of the activists and the organizations in question. Then there is this whole question of to what extent lies can violate the freedoms of thought, opinion, and expression. So this is something that has attracted attention recently from various UN special mandates, including the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression and the UN Special Rapporteur on thought and religion and freedom of conscience. You'll remember the distinction that the freedom of opinion, which is essentially the same thing as the freedom of thought, is about the forum internum, like your ability to have thoughts in your head, your opinions in your head, without interference. It's an absolute right. Whereas the freedom of expression is the right to express these opinions. It's a qualified right, which can be limited in certain circumstances, but it's a right that's much broader than simply talking, right? It's a right about seeking and receiving and imparting information and ideas of all kinds. So, for example, when you do a Google search, you're actually expressing yourself because you're seeking information. Yeah? So, when it comes to the freedom of opinion, the forum internum, there's a really good article by Evelyn Oswald recently, which really analyzes this particular right in a very rigorous way. And she explains that there are three basic ways in which a state can violate this right. First, it can compel people to disclose their opinions. Second, it can punish them for holding certain opinions. And third, and this is most relevant for us, it can coerce or manipulate people into having certain opinions. So the question for me in the paper is, when can state lies really violate that third prong of the freedom of opinion? I mean, I deal with this extensively in the paper. There is certainly a scenario in which lies normally as part of a broader package could violate this aspect of the freedom of opinion. This is actually when people are brainwashed, let me put it that, like they are, you saw the images or the videos of young adolescents in Ukraine, in Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine, who were compelled to go into Russian schools, into Russian indoctrination, sort of in patriotic indoctrination, and are now serving in the Russian armed forces against Ukraine. Yeah. So North Korea, is a state that does this in the most systematic way. This is a country where in the classroom, every child every day has to criticize themselves, say something bad they did that day, and criticize one of their classmates. You see what I mean? So when you have that kind of environment, that is clearly a violation of freedom of opinion. And part of that is done through lying. It is really difficult to achieve that level of intrusion into one's mind through lying alone, but certainly lying is part of the package. Now, the special rapporteurs have been arguing that algorithmic manipulation on social media could be a form of intrusion into one's forum internum, into freedom of opinion. I personally find that to be a bit much, yeah? So I don't think that kind of lying or manipulation necessarily deprives people of their agency. So I don't think every Russian, for example, who is constantly subjected to a barrage of state media of lies through state media, is a victim of a violation of their freedom of opinion, yeah, that they've lost the ability to control their mind. I don't think that's the case, but certainly that argument has been made. So I argue basically for a somewhat more conservative approach than the one that the special rapporteurs have given. On the other hand, I argue for a somewhat more expansive approach when it comes to freedom of expression. So already during the pandemic, Mike Schmidt and I published an article about health-related disinformation. And we made an argument that if a state creates an environment that is completely flooded with lies, right? Where state agents for example, on the topic of public health, constantly communicate lies to their own population, that does interfere with freedom of expression. that part of freedom of expression which is seeking and receiving information. Because most people want to find accurate information. So for example, if you were living in Tanzania during COVID, and the entire government was telling you, there's no such thing as the virus is not here. Vaccines, you don't need vaccines, eat garlic or whatever, have some herbal remedy. That kind of, by the way, the president of Tanzania died from COVID later on, right? But that kind of environment where lies are all around you and you can't really distinguish the truth from the lie, which is the position, for example, of the average Russian when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, right? Is a violation, I would submit, of the freedom of expression. Isolated lies, like single lies, though, I don't think can cross that threshold. It has to be something systematic. There is, however, a freedom of expression scenario where isolated lies can violate that right. That's a particular aspect of that right, which is now recognized by many human rights bodies, which is the right of access of information in public interest. Yeah. So you are a government department, only you have some information. How much money was spent on a particular project? Yeah. And the people tend to have the right to ask you to disclose that information. So that particular right can be violated by a state lie in a number of scenarios, even an isolated lie. So for example, the state can lie and say, we don't have that information, even though they do. Or they can say, we do have the information, but we're not going to give it to you for reasons of national security. And they lie because there's no reasons of national security to prevent the disclosure of the information. Or they can give you the information, but falsify the records. Yeah? Doctor it. So the information they disclose is actually a lie, right? So in those scenarios, freedom of expression can be violated even through an isolated lie. There's a recent case of the European Court that basically says that. It's called Association Burestop 55 against France, where the court said the right to access information in public interest is about reliable information. Mm-hmm. So if you lie, yeah, you violate that right. Then I move to a completely different context, which is not freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, but is the context of various kinds of investigation. Yeah? So you'll recall that many human rights have a positive procedural dimension. So for example, the right to life, the prohibition of torture and human treatment, don't just tell the state, don't torture people, don't kill people. They also tell the state, if a killing happens, if someone is mistreated, you have to effectively, independently investigate that event, right? And there are various scenarios in which state lies, so again, lies by state agents can violate this duty. One scenario is when state agents frame a person for committing a crime, for example, that they haven't committed. There's a legion of these types of examples. So this is something routinely done even in democratic states, right? So the police plant evidence on the crime scene. They later testify, they lied about the provenance of that evidence. The person gets convicted, yeah? So there's a whole series of violations. So for example, in Japan, a guy was recently released from death row 46 years after his conviction for a murder he did not commit. He was 80-something, yeah? And he was convicted on the basis of fabricated evidence by the police, right? So this is a straightforward scenario in which lying by the state can violate a whole series of rights, from the right to a fair trial to the right to human treatment, because the person then spends decades in a captivity, to right to private life, pick your right. There's also a different kind of scenario where state agents don't necessarily frame somebody, but they cover up their own wrongdoing. Yeah? So this is typical of situations where, again, the police use lethal force. And then they say, well, I thought the person was a threat, so that's why I shot them. Yeah? So that kind of lying in the conduct of an investigation can, again, violate the procedural duty to investigate. It can violate all sorts of other rights depending on how it's done. And then finally, there is this whole idea that I'm sure you've heard of, the right to know the truth, yes, which stems from one particular context, and that is the human rights violations we now know as enforced disappearance. Yeah? Where a person is disappeared and the element of the crime is hiding what happened to them. Yeah? So if state agents lie about what happened to a particular person, that is actually a constitutive element of an enforced disappearance. Yeah? There is ample human rights jurisprudence that now shows that family members, for example, have the right to know what happened to their loved ones. So if states lie to them about the fates of their loved ones, that's a violation of that right. There's also a more expansive jurisprudence about gross human rights violations and a societal variant of the right to know the truth that I don't want to get into. Then another scenario would be, it's kind of similar to this one, when state agents deliberately lie about historical crimes and gross human rights violations. So let me give you a practical example. Every political figure in Serbia today deliberately lies about the involvement of Serbia in various kinds of crimes committed during the wars of the 1990s. Yeah? So we have reached a point where 90% of the population don't believe in the facts of, for example, the 1995 Srebrenica genocide as the ICTY establishes them. Right? Or, if you can think of a different scenario, think of a scenario in which state officials publicly go out and deny that the Holocaust happened, right? Or that Auschwitz happened, or that there were gas chambers in Auschwitz. So this kind of scenario is, again, most often dealt with from the standpoint of freedom of expression. If private individuals do this, can we prosecute them for negating the Holocaust or for committing those kinds of offenses? And human rights bodies are now saying, actually, you shouldn't. Like, you shouldn't have criminal offenses that simply punish the denial of certain historical crimes. That's an undue interference with freedom of expression. You should only do it if it's actually a coded way of inciting hatred. Yeah. So the European Court is now basically saying Holocaust denial in Europe is a coded way of doing anti-Semitism, right? But it might not be that somewhere else. Yeah. But again, my problem is different. It's not about whether you can justifiably limit this speech if you're the state by criminal means. It's if the state lies to its people by denying historical crimes. Again, there's a recent case before the European Court of Human Rights against Romania, where Romanian courts falsely acquitted in the 1990s, former high officials of Romania who participated in crimes against Jews in the Second World War. And all of this was done as part of a package in which Romanian officials essentially tried to launder the behavior of Romania during World War II, to basically blame the Germans for everything and say, we're Romanians, we're nice. Yeah? So in this particular case, which is called Zaescu versus Romania, the court finds that this acquittal of these people who directly participated in, I can't remember whether it was a pogrom or something like that, directly violated the private life, the right to private life combined with the prohibition of discrimination of the survivors of that event and their families. So basically saying there's a direct injury to the dignity of the victims if the courts lied about it. Yeah? The Romanian courts lied about it.
How come private life?
Because it's a catch-all right. So Article 8 is an incredibly broad right, which includes not simply, what you do in your four walls. It includes your mental well-being. It includes, all sorts of other interests. But then, I'm going to talk. I talk in the article. I don't have to talk about it now. I'm just going to give you some examples about public health because that's the easiest example of how state lies can injure human rights. So again, one scenario is the state lies to its own people about COVID. before COVID, the worst example, it's still probably the worst example, is AIDS. It's South Africa under Thabo Mbeki deciding we don't want to buy antiretroviral drugs, telling people, no, AIDS, HIV is not that dangerous, don't bother, take garlic, take herbal stuff. Hundreds of thousands of people getting AIDS in South Africa. So that kind of scenario, again, the mere communication of those messages suffices to create state responsibility for a violation of the right to health. Yeah? I don't see why it should be any morally or legally different if the state does that to a population of another state, which is the extraterritoriality problem. See what I mean? Morally, how can that be different? Yeah. Anyway, but I can talk about that later. And then the final example I look at is the right to participate in public affairs, which includes the right to stand for election, the right to vote, and a more general right to be involved in how a country is run. Yeah? There are numerous ways in which state lies can violate that right. You suppress the vote by disseminating lies about, the dangers of voting or about other political parties. You harass a candidate by spreading lies about them. You promote other candidates using lies. You see what I mean? If the state apparatus does that, and in hybrid regimes and authoritarian states, they routinely do that, yeah, I think you can easily make the argument to say that lies as such violate this particular right. Good. So that's the example I sort of go through. Now, there are two other questions I sort of deal with in the paper. Well, there's a third question, which is that you can also lies can violate other obligations under human rights law, which are not necessarily human rights. So, for example, under the European Convention, there's a right to individual petition. Yeah? There's a duty of states to cooperate with the court. So if states lie in judicial proceedings, which they do, yeah? So, for example, Russia has done that on more than one occasion. Think of a case like Carter versus Russia, which is about the assassination of Alexander Litvinenko in London. So the court asked them, give us information you have on this assassination. Russia refuses to provide that information. That can violate the duty to cooperate. It can enable the court to join evidentiary inferences and so on and so forth. Anyway, so the two questions that are most related to the topic of this conference is lying to the people of other states, so this, which involves this extraterritoriality problem, and then whether lies can ever be justified. So when it comes to lying against the population of other states, my core argument is the same argument I made in my book many years ago, which is that negative duties not to do things are not subject to limitations. So if I can injure your human rights, like your right to health, by disseminating vaccine disinformation online, I should have a duty not to do this. See what I mean? I don't think one needs to go through a jurisdiction analysis, a functional approach, whatever. If you want to do that, then I'm going to say, if you lie about somebody's health in such a way that their decisions about their health are influenced by what you say, then you are controlling their exercise of their right to health, which is the functional model, or you are exercising a form of authority or control over them. So that would be my basic argument there. And we can work this through many other scenarios. So in England, for example, we recently had a case, and the same thing happened in Australia, where we had special forces people who were in Afghanistan who were caught systematically lying about what they did in Afghanistan. So you may have seen this in Australia. The highest ranking, most decorated soldier in Australia, this guy, lost a defamation trial he brought against a newspaper, where it turned out that he was killing, and a bunch of other people with him, were killing civilians in Afghanistan. Then they were planting evidence like guns, to make them appear to have been militants, then lied to whatever military inquiries existed to determine what happened, yeah? So that whole process of lying, of tampering with evidence in Afghanistan is, to my mind, equally a human rights problem as if the guy did that in Australia. Like, I can't see a legal or moral reason of principle why an Australian soldier or a police officer is not allowed to do that in Australia, but would be allowed under human rights law to do that in Afghanistan. You see what I mean? So I, as far as the extraterritoriality issue is concerned, at least have very little doubt about that. I mean, you can find some support on when it comes to lying in some statements made by even special mandates. So, for example, in this joint declaration of fake news, they said that the standards that they outline, which include basically an idea that states should not deliberately spread false information, apply regardless of frontiers, so as to limit restrictions not only within a jurisdiction, but also those which affect media outlets and the communication system outside their jurisdiction or reaching populations of other states. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, finally, there's this whole question of justification. So if you look at the moral literature on lying, and there's a mountain of it, from Plato to Kant to Grotius, lots of stuff on lying, yeah? So it is really the core focus that they have is on when is it justified to lie. And you have all those examples, like the Nazis knock on the door, you're hiding Jews in your basement and the Nazis are knocking on your door. Are you allowed to say, no, I don't have them? Or do you commit a moral fault by lying? See what I mean? That kind of issue. Do you approach this question from a utilitarian standpoint, from a categorical, deontological, whatever? There's a mountain of stuff written on this, and I don't want to repeat it. From a legal standpoint, I would say two things. One, most lies, even by state agents, are not human rights problems. They're human rights problems only if they interfere with the protected interest of a specific person. And that interest falls within the ambit of human rights law. So, for example, if states lie about military secrets, if China gets accused of spying on America and lies and says that we didn't do it, that's not as such a human rights problem. So for lies to be a human rights problem, they actually have to tangibly affect individuals, like in the context of public health, right? Now, then if we move to the question of justification, normally in the human rights context, we do this through that legality, legitimacy, necessity, proportionality test for restrictions on human rights. Some of these criteria are a bit artificial to apply, like the legality test. No state will have a law that says it is justified to lie in certain circumstances. So that's a bit of a problem. When it comes to legitimacy, most of the examples I gave you would fail any justification analysis because in the examples I gave you, they don't pursue any legitimate aim. If you're lying to punish journalists for doing their job, you're not pursuing any legitimate aim. If you're lying to malign China, and disrupting the public health of the Philippines, what are you going to say? National security? Give me a break. See what I mean? So in most of these cases, you're really not going to have any kind of legitimate aim. However, there might be some cases in which such a legitimate aim could exist and the necessity proportionality analysis will kick in. One example might be a state, for example, Ukraine, which is attacked by Russia and which is trying to maintain the morale of its population by minimizing the losses of, say, its people on the battlefield. So imagine a situation where, I'm not saying they've done it, but imagine if Ukrainian officials are deliberately lying to their people in order to keep their morale up. Another scenario could be something like a new virus, and you are asked a particular question. You know that if you tell the truth, you would provoke a panic and that people would die, and therefore you lie to save more lives. That's the kind of scenario in which, even under a consequentialist analysis at least, you could say lying could be justified. In more pedestrian terms, for example, in criminal investigations, many states employ undercover agents, which are a form of lying. So a state agent will present themselves to be something else, yeah, in the conduct of a criminal investigation, and within limits, that would be a justified form of lying. And then finally, really the most interesting bit, perhaps, for the topic of this conference is lying in war. Yeah. Now, again, so if you look at Grotius in the Law of War and Peace, he, relying on Plato, says basically that rulers can lie for the public good, either to their own people or to the enemy, but within limits. So, for example, for Grotius, you could never, once you, for example, conclude an armistice or some kind of ceasefire, yeah, you are not allowed to break it. You're not allowed to lie in the making, for example, of those kinds of agreements, even though he regards lying, generally speaking, as a violation of rights. So in terms of IHL, I suppose the obvious example of lying are forms of ruses of war which lead to death, right? So these ruses can include lies, meaning statements, but they can also include other kinds of deceptive behavior that are meant to lead to the easier killing of your opponent. And generally speaking, as a matter of IHL, we would regard that as justified. From a human rights perspective, it would be a taking of life as an interference with the right to life, right? But then we have forms of lying or deception that are prohibited, like perfidy. Yeah. So if you put a red cross on your van, yeah, and you misuse the emblem, you are actually lying. You're communicating to people observing you that you are a medical unit when you're not. And this is, for example, something we regard as prohibited. So that's basically the bottom line of the paper, right? You know, my point is that lying as such can be a human rights violation, that it's often integral to human rights violations, which include a whole package of things and behaviors, not just lying, that, you know, autocracies do it, but democracies do it too. And that especially in a position now where so many liars are coming into power, there's a certain value attached to stigmatizing that behavior as a law-breaking activity when it happens, but only to the extent it interferes with human rights. So much of state lying is not a human rights problem. You know, Boris Johnson, you know, is a person who lied every time he woke up. But most of his lies were a political matter for the electorate to be able to deal with, you know, in elections, in the political process. Only some of his lies may be interfered with the human rights of the population. You see what I mean? So anyway, that's sort of my paper. Thank you so much.
So we already have a list of few persons who want to ask questions. I want to start with a preliminary question. Do you differentiate between lying and not telling the truth?
It depends on what you mean by not telling the truth.
Not giving an answer.
So lying by omission. So generally speaking, yes, I do. So, and if you look at the philosophical literature, being silent on a particular issue is not usually regarded as a lie. So a lie requires a statement. Yeah. So there's no such thing as lying by omission. Yeah. Unless in a particular context, your silence will be understood as saying something, which it could be. Yeah. So, you know, if I asked you now, Ido, obviously you're not hungry now, after we had all that food, and you just kept quiet, I would regard that as you saying, yes, I'm not hungry. You see what I mean?
That's
so
lying by implication?
It's exactly. So in that particular context, the silence is actually a message, a statement. But in most contexts, lying by omission is not a lie, as defined in philosophy or as defined by me.
Does it not depend on whether there's an obligation to respond or something like that? Because omission is usually implied that it was an obligation to act.
Yes.
So you're ignoring that.
No, because the question is simply, is there a statement? Yeah, you cannot lie without statement. You can be deceptive without statement, but you cannot lie without saying something. See what I mean?
Okay, so let's start with the other.
So thanks, Marko. It's a fascinating subject, and you've mentioned the philosophical literature several times, and it's ethics literature specifically. So brings me to the question. So their initial position is that lying is bad, and they're almost obsessed with lying. There are so many papers, right? So if you define human rights as some important interest of a human being, and you look at the moral literature and you see that lies have such a significant place, why can't we have like a general right to truth or like prohibition of lying?
That was Grotius.
That is beyond just looking at the right to health or whatever. And I think that you can easily, if you read a right to tell the truth about mass atrocity or whatever through Article 8, as you described, I think that it's possible, at least theoretically, to suggest that all lies interfere with human rights to some extent, but then you have a shorter piece because you won't need to engage with all of this. Right. So this is one issue. And the second is, to what extent you don't only have a permission to lie, but an obligation to lie if it saves human life, right? So we can imagine that it's not just permissible, but you actually have an obligation in order to protect others. And the third question is, to what extent is reciprocity a thing here? Because I think that a major problem for some states is that other states just lie all the time. And if they're engaged in a conflict, they lose the battle by not acting in the same way. So we have like a bot farms that spread misinformation that significantly affects it. So to what extent do they have a right to have some kind of countermeasure that directly, and here it's a problem because it's human rights. So
exactly.
Can we say that it's something like it's a violation of human rights, but it's not as severe as other rights, or it's so necessary to the extent that maybe the price that we pay for is so important that reciprocity is a thing in this specific context?
So let me do this in reverse. In the human rights context, I really can't imagine a scenario where you could use a reciprocity-based argument to justify lying. So imagine, Russia sends vaccine disinformation to America, and then that somehow justifies America sending vaccine disinformation to Russia. No. I mean, both are wrong, right? In the same way, we do not think war crimes by one party justify the war crime by another party. Like, it's the same logic, right? And for most of these things, it's like that. Yeah? At least, I mean, I cannot think of an example we just saw from all the examples I've been through where reciprocity could work like that. It could be, for instance, but this is not a reciprocity-based argument, that sometimes, this is in the logic of saving more lives, or maximizing public good. Maybe you want to destabilize Iran, for example, or North Korea by lying, to induce an uprising in an authoritarian regime. And maybe that's for the greater good. See what I mean? Now, I mean, talk about legality and formalism. Let me read you out something. There's a policy paper published last year by the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. Okay. Now, this is what they say. This is the view of the American military. With appropriate authorities, the joint force can weaponize information to manipulate an adversary's perception of reality by influencing and disrupting social systems and technical connections that are foundational to a modern society. Disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda can trigger a chain of events in an adversary society that gradually degrades its domestic unity, undermines societal trust in its government institutions, and diminishes its international stature. Cyber attack, disinformation spread across social media, false narratives disguised as news, and similar subversive activities weaken societal trust by undermining the foundations of government, like law and order, societal relations, and policy. This is you. Like if Russia does this to us, shouldn't we be allowed to do this to Russia? Yeah. So again, if we are talking about some kind of lying that is meant to overthrow Putin, maybe. But I can't see a scenario where you do that with vaccines, where you do that with voting in what are otherwise free elections, where you do that to the right to education. See what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I cannot see scenarios where that could be ever justified. By the way, they are expressly saying, we're going to do this, we're going to lie to the population of other states. And again, I cannot see how, like, the Chinese vaccine disinformation thing could be ever justified in a human rights framework.
Can I have a put your finger on this?
Yeah.
But just because we don't like it doesn't mean it's a violation of an international law.
Why not?
Because it's not how it works. Even
Why
in the
not?
examples you gave, you
Yeah.
always indicated the underlying human right that needs to be violated, well, that needs to be there
Sure.
in the first place. And there's a bigger problem here. State responsibility for any human right, any international law violations does not hinge on intent or any mental
Who
element.
told you that?
The International Law Commission.
That's not what it said. So
And
open, sorry. Your two fingers,
Yes.
That's plainly wrong. So open the ILC articles. They will tell you, we do not want to say anything on fault, because fault is a question of primary rules.
Obligations, exactly.
So lying in this context is a question of primary rules.
Show me a primary rule where the approach of the acting state agent towards the information is an element of the obligation.
Legitimate aim. There's always an element of
It's
aim.
always like that. So you have cases like Navalny versus Russia, where the court finds a violation of Article 18 of the European Convention because Russia is deliberately targeting Navalny for engaging in political activism with an ulterior purpose. The court proves.
Yeah, but how does the element of a
Next.
lie here is relevant? How can you, let me rephrase it. You can make exactly the same argument and lead, I believe, to the same result without the element of the lie.
I see what you mean. So the point you're making sometimes is that unintentional falsehoods could also violate some of these rights. And that is true in some contexts.
Even truths could do that.
Yes, that's the point.
Like, it
And
doesn't have to be unintentional.
it's the
falsehood.
conduct that matters.
I completely agree with that. So
The physical manifestation of a conduct.
So I remember I told you in the example where a journalist is being punished by spreading a fake video about them. I told you, a truthful video.
That's the classic example.
Could be like that. In the right to health context, for example, it could be that you are negligent in providing advice to your population on matters of public health, which causes harm, but you did not intentionally lie to them. So it could be in some context that lower forms of fault, lower than intent, suffice for responsibility. Do you see what I mean?
I do, okay, later.
Two fingers are down. So let's continue with, you finished answering, yeah?
Did I?
Started with the last one.
What did I forget?
You skipped the other.
No, the middle one.
It's fine.
So
you know.
the middle one I completely
Yeah,
agree.
it's
So, yeah, sometimes you
the first one is whether following the importance of telling the truth in moral
when you
literature.
have a general right.
Can we look at it as something that is so important to human beings to establish?
So
independent
Grotius did that. So if you read the Law, War, and Peace, Grotius says every lie is a violation of any person's right. So he regarded every lie as a violation of our right to make up our own mind on certain things. Yeah, our freedom basically to make our own opinions. You could do that. I don't need to do that because I have the specific human rights listed in the treaties. You see what I mean? So I don't have to fill everything into the right to private life when I have the right to health, I have the right to public participation.
but it does make a huge difference because according to your position, not all lives violates rights. Right?
Right.
So there is here.
There is. Sure. Sure.
So how come you intentionally divert from the moral literature that emphasizes lies so much as something that is core to our understanding of ethics?
Well, because the moral literature, like there are many different ways of arguing this, many different strands to the moral literature. Not all of it says that every lie is a violation of a right. You see what I mean? So, and I have the actual framework of human rights treaties, which can be used in these specific contexts.
Okay, we have a long list, so let's move forward.
Thank you for the presentation. Two short historical comments on the situation in which the issue was raised. So first of all, in World War I, at certain points, each side argued that the pilots of the other side, by disseminating leaflets of propaganda, have committed a war crime. That is a war crime in and of itself, the dissemination of propaganda. And the issue was resolved after the war in the rules, the Hague Rules of Aerial Warfare. And you have Article 21, which is relatively accepted as customary international law, which states that the use of aircraft for the purpose of disseminating propaganda shall not be treated as an illegitimate means of warfare. Meaning that at least then, assuming that it's still customary law, propaganda, which is aimed to destabilize the government of the other side, is considered legitimate, even if it's political, not military, and even though that can harm people's rights, certainly if it's a democratic, the enemy is a democratic, has a democratic government. The other example, and it's a bit forgotten, if you look at there are still few manuals that defined as one option, one possibility of perfidy, declaring someone on the enemy side as an outlaw. And it's usually, and it's the historical background is forgotten. Accusing someone of being an outlaw was actually accusing that person of committing a war crime. And claiming that since I cannot capture that person and put him on trial, he's wanted dead or alive and anyone can execute him. So it's perfidy only if you wrongly accuse someone of a war crime and declare him an outlaw. So at least in that context, it was considered perfidy to wrongly accuse your enemy of an individual within the enemy ranks of committing a war crime.
Interesting. I like that. I'm going to look into it. Thank you so much. Bettina.
Thank you so much. Very interesting and thought-provoking. A lot of rabbit holes to fall into. I wanted, like, my first question would have been the one of Ido, and I just wanted to extend it a bit. What if it's like you said, you need a statement to make a lie? What is it if you withhold information in a statement? Is it a lie or not? And then the whole issue of the lie is the problem of truth. I mean, do we really know?
Do we know what's true or not?
Of course, we know certain things for sure, but the problem are always the fringe cases or the interpretation cases. I remember a conversation with a Turkish formal work colleague from Turkey, and regarding Armenia, she was like, yes, people died, but it wasn't a genocide. Is that a lie? Or is it just a different interpretation of a truth? So I think there's a lot of difficult issues if you want to work with the concept of lying. Because of the truth, that is the problem.
So I agree with that. I mean, actually, in the paper, I spent quite a bit of time on this, which I haven't done in the presentation. So there's the whole fact opinion thing, right? So lies are something that relates to particular claims of fact that are objectively verifiable. It does not relate to matters of opinion or qualification or something like that. Is it a genocide? Is it not a genocide? You know, are dogs better pets than cats? They are, like on any measure. You know, you see what I mean? Like, so generally speaking, I confine the concept of a lie only to that kind of objectively verifiable fact. Is the sky blue? Is the sky not blue? Were 1,000 people killed there, or were 1,000 people not killed there? You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Now, if you employ some kind of philosophical approach which denies the the existence of truth anyway, my argument falls apart. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's only if you think there is such a thing as objective reality that my argument makes any kind of sense. But I think most of us agree.
I agree.
Yeah. And then obviously people are entitled to their opinions, but they're not entitled to their facts. And we have all sorts of legal contexts in which we authoritatively determine what actually happened. That's what criminal courts do. That's what civil courts do in defamation. You know, we do it all the time. We have to determine what happened. Yeah. Now, a lie, though, is not a piece of objectively false information. A lie is something that's untruthful, meaning the person thought it was not true. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So if I tell you, I have 1,000 euros in my pocket, and I think I do, that's not a lie. You see what I mean? Even if I don't have 1,000 euros in my pocket. You see what I mean? So one reason I pick the concept of a lie is that it depends on the subjective mental state of the speaker. It is not about the objective falsity of the information. See what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So truthful is different from true.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Really interesting. I was wondering throughout the presentation what function the role of the lie actually plays in this, and I have the feeling that it's going towards in two different tracks. Mm-hmm. Some of the examples, you might say the lie is in itself a constitutive element of the harm. So, for example, the investigative duties, enforcement appearances, and accountability. But in your previous examples, actually, it really doesn't matter. It's just the vessel, to El's point, which is it can be truthful. But I was wondering whether it makes sense to actually differentiate these, because the way in which they were listed, it felt like it's just...
I do that in the paper. So I explain in the paper that in some situations, a lie is simply a means towards an end. Okay. Like inciting violence. You can incite violence in many other ways. You don't have to lie. Yeah.
But I think it does make a difference to say what kind of... And the second question that I had was on this question of justifiable rights, because with some rights, it can help. You might be able to do
a balancing exercise.
But with some of them, especially freedom of thought and opinion,
it's an absolute right.
It's an absolute right. Yeah. So it depends on how you frame this. And I was wondering to what extent you've seen anything, or what your argument really is there, because the lie doesn't seem to be a good standard for this.
For what? Sorry.
For freedom of opinion or freedom of thought. So a lie as such is probably not what we're looking at in terms of interference with freedom of thought.
I see what you mean.
But it must be something different, which might be that through different things, we're just eroding the capacity of an individual to reason.
So the concept that the special rapporteurs kind of rely on is that of manipulation. So, I mean, there are various, again, I deal with this in the paper, but there was not enough time to do it in the presentation about how the notion of lying relates to other cognate or similar concepts like deception, propaganda, manipulation, coercion. Yeah. So often, like that literature focuses on the idea of manipulation. But then the question is, what does that mean? Right? It's also not the technical term of art in the law. Propaganda, also not the technical term of art in international human rights law. We have it in one article, Article 20 of the ICCPR, which prohibits propaganda for war. And then there's a question of what that means. Yeah. But you're right. Like so if you look at those reports of Irene Khan, the current special rapporteur on free speech and opinion, so she focuses on this idea that, for example, users of social media platforms are manipulated into certain kinds of behavior. They're not necessarily being lied to. You see what I mean? The platform doesn't necessarily lie to them, but it serves them lies or other kinds of material in a way that's manipulative.
Yeah.
Martin? Actually, I would like to sort of continue the debate which we just had. First of all, thank you for the presentation and thank you for those ideas, because to translating this kind of reality, global reality into legal terms, international legal terms, requires a lot of thought and a lot of capability to stay on the top of things. So thank you for doing that. I was thinking that I would join what has been said here, let's say some doubts when it comes to, let's say, the distinction of lie and truth. But all these concepts, not just what is a lie and what is the truth, but actually also sort of well, the human rights require an intercultural consensus. I mean, I know that you mentioned that you are basically dealing with human rights as they are enshrined in universal human rights treaties. But even there, we don't have a fully agreed and perfectly universally accepted scope of those rights enshrined in this. So actually, all the concepts you are using are more or less, but I would rather argue more, subject to intercultural consensus. And when it comes to, when I just pick the one topic, and that's the lie, in some of the societies, it's even if we take as a lie what you describe as a lie, so that it's objectively something which is against the objective truth, it can be culturally desired. We have societies when the lie is desired in order to preserve stability, social stability, etc., etc. And then I'm just wondering whether this you would see as a point for what you have in your article as a justification, or would you place it rather in discussion and exclude these kind of situations already from your consideration? So what about with situations which are objectively a lie, but actually taking into account the cultural underpinning or understanding?
Can you give a specific example?
In Asian cultures, it can be more important to
Save the face.
To save the face, and also depending on the hierarchy of the person, to actually describe a situation or a problem in order to preserve the the stability in the society or in the societal group. I can't be at the moment more specific.
But that's a problem, right? Because actually what you're describing happens in all cultures. We lie all the time. Yeah? Your girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever asks you, how do I look today? What are you going to say? You're not going to say, you look like crap, darling. You're not going to say that, right? So we lie all the time, right? So there's this whole, again, in the moral literature, the idea of white lies, the kinds of lies that sort of, actually make human interaction actually feasible. You don't want to be Israeli direct, if I can be so direct all the time. It really often causes problems, right? So what I would like to hear is a concrete example of a lie that actually affects human rights interests that is culturally contingent. I don't know of such a thing. So unless you can give me an example of such a thing, it's a non-problem. See what I mean?
Okay.
So you can't say, in North Korea, it's culturally accepted for Kim Jong-un to lie to his people all the time. I don't think that's a cultural thing. It's a dictatorship thing. You see what I mean?
It's dictatorship culture.
Well,
Example of lying not to spread the panic.
that's a good example. But I don't think it's particularly culturally contingent. So that's an example of a possibly justified lie. If there's something horrible is about to happen. If I tell, I'm the president. If I tell the truth, it's going to cause horrible consequences. I mean, that's one scenario in which, I would think.
I would say Santa Claus is.
It's a nice lie to tell the children.
Lie.
If you know
He lives in Svalbard.
Yes, thank you, Professor, for the presentation. I would like to make some comments. I have a question for you about the police when they lie. For example, they used to kill someone. Sometimes they add a gun in the body of the person. They see that it was it was a sort of self-defense. And there's some other cases where you are in a country, you don't speak the language, and the police force you to sign a paper you don't know.
A confession, yes.
That's it's a lie. And sometimes in some countries, in matter of migration, there are sometimes the states make what the law calls forced mass deportation. And they say that the people the victims of mass deportation, they leave the country according to their will. It's not true. They say that in the public declaration. And about the question of the right to truth, I don't know if you see it in this sense. In the inter-American system of human rights, there are a lot of
many cases on this.
Like that. And it's a sort of it's a measure of reparation. They call it a measure of satisfaction. There are a lot of measures of reparation that they made. If you want, you can see it like that. I remember that I read an article, a text about the genocide in Rwanda. When the people find the opportunity to identify the women arrest, the women, the bones of the lovers of them, they were very happy. That's when they make exhumation. When they were holding the ground to find the body of the people, the women. They were very happy. They felt a sort of a freedom just to show that how it's important, the right to truth as a measure of reparation. That's what I will do.
Yeah, I mean, I agree on all counts. If you want to read a case about lying in the context of deportations, there is a recent case against Poland before the European Court of Human Rights, where basically you had mass expulsions of people coming into Poland from Belarus. And Poland was saying, oh, but no, we did give each of them an individual opportunity to make an asylum claim. These people were saying, no, we were never given this opportunity. Border guards, so there's this whole question of evidence in the case. Polish border guards produced written records saying, yeah, that person was deported, whatever, they did not make an asylum claim. The court finds, on the basis of evidence provided regularly by non-governmental organizations, is that Polish border guards have a systemic practice of lying and forging documents about border crossings. And the court therefore rejects Poland's explanation that the people were not expelled en masse, without any kind of asylum hearing. So, I mean, that is a kind of evidentiary issue that arises in the context of proceedings where basically, the court discounts certain evidence because it says it's fake. Yeah, it's not. And on the whole right to truth thing in the inter-American context, I think the core point is basically to distinguish between one scenario which is relatively legally straightforward, and that is when you have the immediate family of a person who's disappeared, for example, who have the right to know what happened to that person, a right which the state can violate by providing them false information, right? From this kind of broader societal right of the society as a whole to know the truth, or the victim group as such to know the truth. That is a much more, I'm not going to say flimsy, but it's different in character from, the right of individual victims to know what happened.
Last but not least.
Oh, okay. First of all, I'm not sure relying on Plato and Grotius is what I would want to do generally in life and in all different kinds of ways. But suppose we do. I was just wondering when you say that Plato, I guess you said, that it might be legitimate to lie to one's own people or the enemy for the public good. Did
both Grotius and Plato say that?
Did they specify who was the public?
So for Plato, it was the population of the whole republic.
Not the enemy.
So he generally speaks of the republic, right? Does not speak of the enemy population. But so for him, the analogy he actually gives is this. It is immoral and stupid if you're sick to go to a doctor and to lie to the doctor about what's wrong with you. It is equally, therefore, immoral for a citizen to lie to the rulers. So the citizen is not allowed to lie to the rulers, the philosopher kings who rule the republic.
Because then they cannot provide the citizen with what they need.
Because they know best. But the rulers are allowed to lie to the citizens because it's for their own good. Like it's a very patronizing kind of
Okay, that doesn't give us an answer about whether the public who's good to be the rulers aim for includes the enemy.
So Grotius deals with that. So Grotius is the one who deals with lying to the enemy. And in the Law of War and Peace, he discusses the types of lying that is permitted, like the ruses of war, and the type of lying that is not permitted. You make an agreement and then you lie about the agreement and you breach it.
Doesn't answer my question, but I do want, I'll bother you about this later, but I do want to go back to the issue of whether the lie is actually constitutive or, I'm just thinking specifically because you said sometimes it's legitimate, it might be legitimate to lie. And doesn't it suggest that it all boils down to legitimate aims and illegitimate aims? Because if the aim is illegitimate, then it doesn't matter whether the statement is true or false. The point is that it infringes, it affects a human rights for an illegitimate purpose. Therefore, it's a violation. And it doesn't matter whether it was a lie or a
But
truth.
the question is, can a truthful statement...
A truthful statement can encroach on the right for an illegitimate purpose, and in which case it would be a violation.
In some cases. So the examples I give in the paper are the examples of inciting violence, yeah? But the question is, in other contexts, like, for example, the public health context, can you think of a situation where a truthful statement can harm the right to public health?
I imagine that I can, but...
This is the example that you gave. If it's direct lying, yeah. So this is exactly it.
The point, what I'm suggesting...
One example.
What I'm suggesting is... But what I'm suggesting is that the fact that...
By the way, it was a beautiful lecture.
The fact that the example that you give is a lie, that is a kind of statement, but it's not the lie that is the... I'm not sure constitutive element would be the term I would use, but maybe that's not the point.
You're talking about the harm to public health, which is the consequence of the lie. You see what so you're saying the violation of the right to public health is the harm that the lie causes rather than the lie as such.
Mm-hmm.
So if you lie to one person, that's not going to harm public health. But if you lie to 10,000 people, and you're in a position of power, you're Robert F. Kennedy Jr., God help us, and you lie about vaccines.
And the government never speaks to a single person. So if you're talking about when the state
lies,
then you're talking necessarily about a public health.
The government all the time speaks to a single person. You go to an office to get a document.
Sorry, I retract.
What's the name of the experiments they did on African Americans male in the 50s?
Oh, the with vaccines.
Yeah.
Where people, one reason of distrust in vaccines is because people were being used as test subjects involuntarily in the African American community.
Thank you very much.